From the nation's capital, the American Enterprise Institute for Public Policy Research presents Public Policy Forums, a series of programs featuring the nation's top authorities presenting their differing views on the vital issues which confront us. Today's topic, terrorism. What should be our response?
The use of terror is the quintessential expression of the end justifies the means. Since the beginning of civilization, international order has been a fragile thing, ravaged again and again by the reach for freedom or power, the two great motivators of organized society, and by the often psychotic savagery of individuals striking out at the societies which gave them birth to satisfy their egos or to salve their frustrations. Rarely in human history has terror been used, but that the justification was that the goals sought were true, good, and just. Accordingly, the most vicious acts of man, even to the present day, are too often wrapped in the cloak of idealistic rhetoric and political revolution, while the underlying motivation is a rationale for revenge against society or a savage appetite for power and recognition. At the same time, history is replete with violent action accompanying legitimate goals. But where does violent action end and naked terror begin? Dumping British tea in Boston Harbor is a far cry from the casual murder of 32 innocent people which accompanied the 1973 Black September incident of passenger lounge mayhem and airplane hijacking in Rome and Athens by the PLO extremists. The Black September justification was that anyone traveling to Israel, no matter what his nationality, or aboard an American airliner, the U.S. had airlifted weapons and supplies to Israel in the 1973 war, was automatically an enemy of Palestine and therefore a legitimate target. Even the Palestine Liberation Organization condemned this attack as harmful to the Palestinian interests. Also in 1973, the Symbionese Liberation Army, a mixture of whites and blacks from American universities, prisons, and the streets, casually murdered the Oakland, California superintendent of schools in what SLA described as war against the fascist capitalist class and all their agents of murder, oppression, and exploitation. The SLA's leader, Thinq, who the following year engineered the kidnapping of Patricia Hearst, said, "We are savage killers and madmen, willing to give our lives to free the people at any cost." The people are the focus of this examination that we are going to conduct tonight, and it is, of course, an examination of terrorism. What should be our collective response here and abroad? Well, to examine this issue, we have an expert panel. To my far right, Mr. Frank H. Perez, a career Foreign Service officer and presently is the acting director of the Office of Combating Terrorism in the State Department. To my immediate right, Senator John East, Republican from North Carolina, a former professor of political science and presently a member of the U.S. Senate Subcommittee on Security and Terrorism. To my immediate left, Mr. Ramsey Clark, author of Crime in America, who has served as adjunct professor of law at Howard University and Brooklyn Law School, and as Attorney General of the United States. And to my far left, Dr. Yonah Alexander, professor of international studies and director of the Institute for Studies in International Terrorism, State University of New York, and author and/or editor of publications on the theory, practice, control, and rationalization of terrorism. Well, gentlemen, the United Nations, even in that atmosphere of violence in the early 1970s, sought without success agreement on a satisfactory definition of terrorism. To better understand our subject, what should be the response to terrorism, I would pose the same question to each of you in turn. How would you define terrorism? Senator East.
Good question. Terrorism is not new in our time, but I suppose what is new is the degree of it and the quality of it. I would define terrorism as the use of violence, either random or selective, to further ideological and national aims. The purpose of it is to intimidate, to traumatize, and to force the tone and direction of the society being terrorized, the group being terrorized, in the direction that the terrorists obviously want it to go. It's an instrument of goading.
Mr. Clark.
Terrorism, to me, is the use of physical or psychological violence to force people to act as you want them to act by fear. Etymologically, in the political context, it came from terror by agents of government, the reign of terror specifically in France. It's important to remember that the definition should include all of its forms. That government can engage in terror. Heavy jets strafing little villages is a form of terror. That it can be the police, the SAVAK, DINA, BOSS, how many other acronyms, terrorizing the people to force them to act as they would have them act. It can be extremes of left or right. The United States has perhaps not known greater terrorism than that inflicted on large segments of our population over many decades by the Ku Klux Klan. How many lynchings, how many cross burnings? Today we see it from left and right, widespread. It has no regard for life or human dignity.
Mr. Perez?
Well, my definition of terrorism is rather straightforward. It's a criminal act to bring about political change. And we in this country don't have any laws against terrorism. We do have laws against criminal acts, and we view a political act which involves murder, kidnapping, bombing, and this sort of thing as a criminal act. And that's my basic definition.
Dr. Alexander.
John, I'd like to start with your point about the United Nations, the inability of the United Nations to reach a consensus. Who are the terrorists? Some nations perceive terrorists as national liberation movements and so on. So I think we have a problem from a universal point of view. But I think what probably we are going to discuss, and I do hope that we are going to focus on the sub-state type of terrorism, terrorism from below, because I think, again, we are looking at changes in terms of contemporary terrorists, if you compare them to older precedents. In other words, we are looking at technology, we're looking at targets, and we're looking at toleration.
Well, actually, we have in your definitions an understanding, broad understanding of what terrorism is. Our task tonight is fundamentally to determine what responses should be made to it. So let me ask first, does the international community take the threat of terrorism seriously? Mr. Perez?
Well, I think that's a very difficult question to answer. Certainly many parts of the world take the problem seriously and they're prepared to do something about it. But in order to deal with the problem of international terrorism, which is a universal problem, you have to have all nations of the world in agreement. So now we have certain nations like Libya, which support terrorism and which engage in terrorism. You have a number of other countries that do the same thing. The problem, I think, with the international scene now is that we have a number of resolutions which many countries have agreed to, but we really have no enforcing mechanism. In fact, the only international agreement that has any enforcement to it is the Bonn Declaration, which only 7 countries have subscribed to. This is on aircraft hijacking.
Anybody wants to talk on the issue? Professor Alexander.
Well, I think basically, John, the problem is First, the absence of a definition which is recognized by the international community. If we cannot agree on what it is, how can we deal with cures? So this is the first problem, because you have to, I think, look at the perception of nations. The Soviet Union, they perceive the problem differently than the United States in terms of national liberation movements. Basically, I would say that we have to, again, start with the contributing factors and then deal perhaps with the responses, because if you find that a number of nations do support this type of violence, actually it's very difficult to control it.
Mr. Clark?
Well, of course, the international community, such as it is, takes the problem of terrorism seriously in many different ways. I believe rather than trying to come together on some definition with all of our cultural and political and economic and social differences, we ought to begin to develop a process. Now, I believe if people would work for the creation of an international court of criminal justice, an international court of habeas corpus, and begin to identify acts, offenses, on which they could agree. It's bad for children to skyjack airplanes, and all countries should agree on that. And it should be an international crime, and people who engage in that sort of conduct should be brought before that court. It is wrong to torture prisoners or to eliminate people in Guatemala by government or by opposition to government without a due process of law, and those things should be addressed. It's unconscionable to take hostages in the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, and a writ of habeas corpus should reach in there. So I think if we begin that process, we can begin to reach an agreement, and at least those who won't agree will identify themselves as the outlaws.
Senator East?
I'm not sure that we take it seriously in the sense that we understand the motivation behind it. I think Mr. Clark makes some excellent points, though where I might depart from him is the implication that through the right kind of legal arrangements, the right kind of international contracts, we might be able to cut through this Gordian knot of terrorism. But what I think that loses sight of is that terrorism, by definition, is going to violate every tenet of accepted legal standard and practice. It's driven by powerful furies, and until one understands the furies, one is not going to be equipped to deal with it in a practical, strategic, or tactical sense.
All right, now, to go back to what you said, Mr. Perez, in 1963, in regard to air piracy, there was a Tokyo Convention, in 1970, a Hague Draft Convention, in 1971, a Montreal Convention on aviation sabotage. Then there were 2 joint air security conferences in Rome in 1973. But would you agree that all have produced very little result in terms of any international coordinated effort to handle the question of terrorism, to find a response to terrorism?
Well, for example, this year we've had 2 hijackings in which the hijackers have not been brought to justice. The 2 countries that they wound up in are adherents to the Hague Declaration. The point I was trying to make before is that we have these pieces of paper, but you need the resolve on the part of the international community to make these pieces of paper stand up.
President
Well, I
Alexander?
would like to add, the problem, it seems to me, is the confusion again over definition, who are the terrorists and who are the freedom fighters. Therefore, I don't think you can expect on the universal level a consensus and a response. It seems to me that you have to look at the various responses on the unilateral level. Let's say in terms of the United States, when the United States made a decision that Libya is violating U.S. domestic law or diplomatic conventions, then the United States expelled Libyan diplomats. So I don't think you can have a comprehensive convention on the international level. You have to deal with this on specific tactical aspects, or as Mr. Clark indicated, in terms of the victims.
Mr. Clark?
I'd like to get back to Senator East's statements about the furies, and this is the hardest part, really. what motivates people to do these things? And I think it's very dangerous to generalize. We read Jane Alpert's new book, Growing Up in the Underground. She'd set off a bomb in Foley Square. She described she felt like riding down Broadway in her wedding dress. She had a bundle with sticks of dynamite in her lap, and she was going down to Foley Square to set this bomb off. You find, finally, reading her book, no ideology, absolute capriciousness. It's sex, it's trying to please Sam Melville, it's drugs and all the rest. Then you take Bobby Sands. Now, we don't accuse people of being terrorists, but we have to talk in terms of the general context of who has been considered. What motivates a man to be willing to die by slowly, deliberately starving himself to death? What could be more painful? Do we have the capacity to wonder? So sometimes, unless we can see it, it's long conditioning of injustice. What can you expect from a people of Guatemala, people of other countries, of Chile, if they've been systematically exterminated by the government? Those are things that we have to examine. Now, as we examine them, I think to try to work with like-minded countries is going to polarize and divide the country. What we want to do is communicate with everybody.
But I would like to comment upon that. Though I think Mr. Clark makes a number of excellent points there, we may have the tendency of our time to yield to sentimentalisms about the character of these kinds of acts and the motivations. For example, during the 1930s, when you took the Nazi stormtrooper mentality and the use of violence and terror there, now one could always rationalize that Hitler and his entourage had some legitimate grievances coming out of inflation or the imperfections of the Treaty of Versailles. I guess to probe it to a little deeper level of theoretical understanding or comment, there are movements, people's ideologies and theories in our time that I think take on the character, if you will, of evil. I would say Nazi stormtrooperism takes on a character there that isn't simply understandable in terms of rationalizing in a way as far as grievances go. And quite candidly, I would, in terms of the Gaddafi regime or the Khomeini regime, in terms of the comments of Mr. Arafat, take for example the terror that kills a Sadat. And then you have national figures like Arafat or Khomeini, Gaddafi, indicating approval of this sort of thing. Now, I am not willing to engage in an easy passing off of that as simply saying, well, these good chaps are upset and they have grievances, and until we get behind their grievances, if we allow that to creep in as a matter of fundamental law enforcement in any country, and if you allow it to creep in as a standard by which you attempt to evaluate and deal with international terrorism, ultimately you'll simply yield to it, because you don't you're not in a position to appreciate that there is an idea here, a fanaticism, frequently I would contend an evil content to it that seeks to destroy and bring about very tormented and perverse ends. Let's not be naive about it.
Professor Alexander?
On a philosophic level, Mr. Clark, I fully agree with you. I like to be idealistic, but we have to look at reality. And the reality is this, in my view. We're talking about terrorism as an instrument of both the weak and the strong. And in general, the question is, if you discuss terrorism, where are you discussing it, in what context? For example, in a democratic society, in a democratic context, I suggest that there are other options, other alternatives. There is no need. There is no need to resort to violence to achieve ends. We have a process, whether it is in the Irish situation or in the United States or Western Europe. In fact, when we examine the terrorists, the profiles, we see that actually terrorists are those who come from a privileged society, from the middle class and the upper middle class. Those who rebelled against the caviar society, let's say in Germany.
Right. Yes, Mr. Perez.
I'd like to respond to the point that Mr. Clark made. And my concern is that while these terrorists feel very strongly about their cause, it seems to me that most of these terrorist groups are small elitist groups who are trying to bring about radical changes, and they don't really represent the people. And they use these strictly criminal acts. And for example, in Northern Ireland, there have been over 2,000 people killed in the violence there. There have been a lot of innocent people killed who've had nothing to do with it. In Spain, you have a fragile democracy, and you have the Basques that are threatening to overthrow it by forcing a military takeover. In Italy, certainly you have a small minority who have nihilistic or anarchistic objectives. In Germany, the same thing. So I don't think we can look upon terrorists from the standpoint which Mr. Clark described. I think you've got to look upon them as criminals. And they, you know, I've dealt with many of the people who've been the families of victims of terrorism, and I've gone through this with them day by day, and I know what they suffer.
Senator East, you favor easing restrictions on the FBI and CIA and their intelligence gathering activity on domestic terrorism. What do you propose?
Well, one specific thing that I have proposed is the modification of the so-called Levy guidelines that were issued in 1976, which in my judgment has greatly impaired the ability of the FBI to investigate and determine whether particular individuals or groups have the potential for evolving into terrorist-prone and violence-prone groups. Now, in order for the FBI to investigate groups of this kind, they must show that the individual or group involved has either committed violence or is about to commit it. It's imminent. And to me, it's a catch-22 situation. The FBI, in order to investigate, has to prove at the outset the very thing that the investigation is designed to prove, namely whether a particular individual or individuals or groups are evolving into violence-prone, terrorist-prone organizations.
Mr. Clark, it's a former Attorney General of the United States. How do you look upon easing the restrictions presently in existence on the FBI and the CIA?
It would be a terrible mistake. They should be strengthened, and they should be incorporated into positive law, legislative law, not executive law. Executive Order 1236 can be changed by a president. It can be ignored with impunity. We ought to remember who we are. We're Americans. We believe in freedom. The worst thing we could possibly do is abandon our freedom because of the fear of terrorism, and how tragically out of proportion. Let's look at the real world. Last year in the United States, 1980, we had 654,000 aggravated assaults against people. We had 548,000 robberies. We had 23,000 murders. This is crime in America. It's something of enormous and immense and immediate concern to us. It reflects our character. And yet, what do we talk about? We talk about terrorism. Think of Italy, West Germany, other countries. We haven't had that sort of terrorism. We won't have that sort of terrorism unless we engage in a general repression denying the very foundation of the country. We were born on principle and the idea of freedom. This is why I think it's meaningless to try to talk about individual terrorism and not government terrorism. It's like talking about the tides and not mentioning the moon. I
would just like to comment on this matter that the Attorney General, who a man, of course, is of great repute and obviously great experience in this area, so I dissent reluctantly, but on this matter of whether we have now given too much power to the CIA or the FBI or too little, we're somewhat disputing over that. I would argue, he's concerned, of course, that this would allow greater threats to civil liberties in this country. Except I would argue civil liberties is a mosaic. And certainly the most fundamental civil liberties you can have is to be protected in your person, one, and to a degree in your property. And certainly as a minimal standard, government ought to be able to do that. Now, to me, those are fundamental civil liberties, civil rights, as much as freedom to speak and to carry on and do this and that and the other thing. If government cannot protect those most fundamental of civil rights, then to me it raises a very serious theoretical question about the efficacy of that government. I don't see anything inconsistent with civil liberties. In fact, I would contend you are strengthening the civil liberties of individual Americans and others.
Well, I don't see how a government can protect civil liberties if it violates them. I think we have to believe in these things, and the Bill of Rights is not a suicide pact, and we're going to live by it because we believe in it. And when you look at what we get for all this, we get Frank Turples, don't we? We get Edwin Wilsons, don't we? We get Dr. Martin Luther King, wiretap, the prophet of nonviolent social change, and finally the president's brother. That's what you get by violating civil liberties. Do you call that freedom?
Professor Alexander.
Mr. Daly, I really think we ought to bridge these two positions. I don't see inconsistencies if we try to analyze the situation. Number one, terrorism is attack against democracy. Terrorism is totalitarianism, denying basic human rights, and I'm actually agreeing with you that this is fundamental. If we don't have principles, why do we exist? Then there is another issue, which I would agree, that we have to be careful in democracy not to overreact. But we have to work, I suggest, on different levels. I would like to suggest that we have to work on the political level in terms of fair government, fair laws, voice to minorities, and try to balance this situation. I don't think you can isolate that. But at the same time, when you do have the weather on the ground emerging once again, when you do have the New World Liberation movement in California attacking utilities, when you do have anti-Castro groups, or when you do have various foreign groups operating in the United States, or when we do have terrorism in other countries and democracies, what are we going to do in terms of law enforcement? I think we have to monitor this, we have to watch it. At the same time, we have to work on the other level, of the political level, in order to provide various alternatives so people can express their grievances and we can find a solution, a peaceful solution, rather than to use the propaganda by the deed, because I suggest that in modern times it's becoming very dangerous if we allow the situation to deteriorate, because today we talk about throwing a bomb. In the future, there is a possibility that terrorist groups would resort perhaps to biological, chemical, nuclear devices, and then I think this would spell the destruction of civilization itself.
Mr. Perez?
Yeah, I think one of the great concerns with terrorism is that it forces governments to do things to try to deal with a situation which affect civil liberties and human rights. Fortunately, in the most enlightened countries, the Western European countries, for example, the governments have been able to do things in a constitutional and lawful manner to tighten up their laws to deal with the situation. But in many other countries, we've seen the governments go too far, and we've seen the sorts of situations that have developed, say, in the southern cone of South America.
Well, let me now bring up, technology was mentioned much earlier, and I wonder what opinion you all have of technology as a future element in an accommodation to some kind of program that will hold off terrorism or inhibit it very greatly. Is technology computerized thumbprint identification to catch the altered passport, aircraft cabins equipped to fill with instant incapacitating gas, etc.? These any real hope for the future? Who has an experience in this area and would offer an opinion?
Well, in terms of technology, I'm afraid that I don't see anything on the horizon that would allow us to cope with the problem. For example, on aircraft hijackings, people talk about a gas that you could use, but then these gases have side effects, and if you have old people or sick people, you might kill them instead of the terrorists. And I think the only way to deal with the terrorism problem is to have experienced people who know how to handle it. The first thing you want to do is to try to prevent the thing from happening. You want to tighten your security, as we have done, for example, at airports. I think it's interesting to note that since we instituted the enhanced security measures at airports, there have been over 20,000 weapons that have been picked up in the routine screening. And so I think this is very important. I think we also need experienced people who know how to handle hostage negotiation and to resolve these things in a peaceful manner. Of course, we have special forces which we've seen used around the world. Entebbe, Mogadishu, last year in London at Prince's Gate at the Iranian Embassy. We do have a much improved capability to assault if that becomes necessary in a terrorist situation. But I don't see any magic solution on the horizon through technology.
Ramsey, you want to, any technical additions you can make?
Well, my experience with technology in this field has been long and unhappy. I think it endangers both safety and liberty. It escalates research and development on both sides, you might say. It's like the arms race. You're not going, you know, we watched wiretapping, which is proved, in my judgment, clearly ineffective in domestic law enforcement. Then we saw jamming devices from the other side in organized crime and elsewhere. We saw their technology coming in and improving ours. We saw the erosion of liberty as we began to put wiretaps on the wrong people. You take National Crime Information Center, the use of computers. The first thing we know, we've got computer data that can't really be screened on millions of people that endangers their liberty and enrages people. I think we're going to have to work with the causes, and technology can only work with the symptoms, with the active outer crust and edge, and we've got to get down to the causes and recognize that it's very often injustice, as much as it hurts us to say it, that drives people to the wildness that we see manifested in terrorism.
I'd like to comment upon that.
Yes, Senator.
John, I'm a bit more troubled with the technology that can be developed and applied by the terrorists themselves. And then, with all due respect to, of course, the distinguished former Attorney General, it strikes me what he is suggesting is here we might engage in a unilateral giving up of developing our own technology in terms of investigation and anticipation. I think that would be a fatal error in terms of the ideological character of much of terrorism in our time. It is a force that cannot be simply explained away in terms of lists of grievances. If we applied that in terms of domestic law enforcement, we simply wouldn't enforce law. We would simply assume that whatever crimes were committed because some way or other the person had been deprived or had grievances and that kind of thing. I'm troubled with that as a matter of domestic law enforcement application, and then when you begin to apply it to the international scene in terms of dealing with terrorism, I think it's a blueprint, potentially, for enormous disaster.
I didn't hear anyone suggest that you don't enforce domestic laws because they're causes of crime. It's simply that you address the causes too. It's more than a game. You care about children and your society. If you don't address them, you're going to continue to have this trouble. We haven't had real problems in this society until recently with the capacity of people to exist underground because people have loved the government. Until 1969, when I left the Department of Justice, in the whole history of the Federal Bureau of Prisons, there weren't 20 people who had escaped, remained underground, and unaccounted for successfully. Now it's getting easy. And one reason is excessive. The best enforcement is the people. The only real enforcement is the people. When the people are watching out and believe in freedom and believe in their country, and when the police are deeply integrated into them and you love them and respect them, then you don't have a problem. But when you alienate them, when you saturate with technology, when you're engaged in constant surveillance, then you're slowly dividing. The greatest tragedy would be if the fear of terrorism caused us to abandon freedom and the belief that we could find safety that way. We'd lose both.
There's one more area of response that I think we could usefully examine. Should the United States unilaterally, in the absence of international agreement on an anti-terroristic program, use economic weapons against clearly identified exporters of terrorism, such as Libya? Mr. Perez?
Well, we do have a number of laws and legislation which deal with this subject. And we are required by the Congress, by the Senate, to provide a list of those countries that have supported terrorist acts. This is the Fenwick Amendment to the Export Administration Act. So currently on this list of countries that we supply at the end of the year are Libya, Syria, South Yemen, and Iraq. And we'll be re-examining the list at the end of this year. For example, in the case of of these countries, we don't sell them any military equipment. We examine sales to them. We've denied sales of commercial aircraft to Libya to indicate our displeasure with their support of international terrorist acts.
Perhaps you want to talk on this issue?
Well, I'm afraid I do, yes. Of course we should use economic sanctions against countries that engage in internal or external terrorism. You can't make the world safe for hypocrisy. And for the United States to be buying oil from Gaddafi and then calling him all these bad names has a certain element of hypocrisy about it. There's no two ways. But finally, we can't be selective. The terrorism of South Africa must not be ignored. They are using Mirage jets, they're using Huey helicopters, and they're just bombing the hell out of southern Angola and other places, and that is terrorism of the most violent sort. And it's not all direct. There's support for Jonas Savimbi and people like that. And it's interesting when we talk, even domestically, our talk about terrorism is so selective. I believe, and I think I can demonstrate to anybody who wants to listen, that internally, within the United States, the most violent terrorist organization is Omega-7. But nobody ever mentions Omega-7. But they'll kill you quick.
Well, I talk about them all the time.
Well, you haven't mentioned them tonight, and they're very rarely mentioned compared with the Provisional Irish Republican Army or the Palestinian Liberation Organization.
I can assure you that the FBI is conducting a very vigorous investigation into this group.
Well, I've been down to Washington several times urging them to do it, and I haven't seen any results.
They are. I can guarantee you that.
I know that.
If I may have one word, Mr. Daly, I think that we certainly have to approach problems on various levels, on the diplomatic, economic, military. May I suggest also on the level of communication? First, I would like to see some clarity in the media to draw a line between commandos and guerrilla fighters and terrorists. There is so much confusion. That's one thing. Secondly, I think we have to diffuse what I would call the religionization of politics or the politicization of religion, the Khomeinism or the Islamic fundamentalism, or waving the flag of religion in order to achieve certain political secular goals. I think the church can play a role. I think the media can play a role. I think education can play a role. I think families can play a role. It's like crime. We really have to operate on different levels. There is no one solution to the problem. There are many approaches, and unless we really mobilize all our forces, I think we're going to remain hostages forever.
Well, I think we've painted a very broad canvas, and it's time for the question and answer session. May I have the first question, please?
Russell Chapin with American Enterprise Institute. One of the troublesome aspects of terrorism is the taking of hostages. And I wonder if Mr. Perez would tell us, if he can, what the policy would be about the taking of hostages. Will we pay ransom to free hostages, or is that the base stone of our policy?
No, I think our policy is very clear on this issue, and that is that we will not give in to terrorist demands or blackmail. We will not pay ransom. We will not release prisoners. And as Undersecretary Kennedy said recently before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, we will not bargain for the release of hostages. So ours is strictly a no negotiation policy. I think the reason for it is obvious, that if you give in to the terrorist demands, you're only going to be faced with more of the same, and you're going to endanger more innocent people.
Anybody else wish to talk to the issue of hostages?
I think the first point is saving life always. Both Attica prison and the Tabas raid in Iran demonstrate the question. There was no one analyzing the situation believed you could save the hostages at Attica prison by force. The real question was the dignity and authority of the state as against the lives of the hostages. The police went in, killed 39 people, including 9 hostages. None had been killed by the prisoners. The Tabas raid, the idea that logistically a military operation could move into the heart of a highly exercised urban population of 4 million people and work through the labyrinthine tunnels under that place and get those people out alive is ridiculous. To try it is to risk their lives. Lives should come first, and you can save lives. I was Attorney General when the first airplane hijacking of recent times at least occurred, and the FBI had rifles trained on the tires, and they said, should we shoot them out? We can keep that plane from taking off. said, look, you make that noise, someone inside's half crazy, and he shoots a gun, kills somebody, hits a gas tank, and the whole plane. You try to save lives, that's the first thing. And you do engage in dialogue. You have to talk to people, always. There's always the possibility of effective communication. You don't pay ransom.
But I'd like to comment upon that. How, appreciating what the Mr. Clark has said, but how do you, in the long run, in keeping with Mr. Perez's point, prevent the thing from turning into a constant cycle of the use of terrorism and the taking of hostages? And it may well be, in the long run, by your not acting in a more decisive way initially, you encourage this sort of thing, and on your own standard of preserving life, in the long run, you may lose more lives because you encourage terrorists to take hostages, to play that game, knowing that it isn't a high-risk game for them. So that's the problem that strikes me, that you have to confront in setting a long-term policy of the type you've described.
The idea that you encourage terrorism is unsubstantiated in experience and history and is invalid. It takes a certain amount of conditioning over a long period of time to get yourself up to do something that wild, because you know how dangerous it is for you yourself as well. And I think it's that sort of fear. That we've got to take a few lives now or destroy the village to save it that has caused us to engage in hostility and in violence and finally in war. Wage war to seek peace. That's what we've said all through history, and it doesn't work too well.
Mr. Perez?
But our view is that everything should be done to resolve the situation peacefully, and but we feel that if you give in to the terrorist demands, that you're just going to invite more of the same. I think.
Suppose the demands are just.
Well, how do you determine whether the demands are just, though?
By using your reason, by examining the facts. Can't we determine what's just? I thought we could.
Well, I think it would all depend upon what the situation was. But if you have terrorists, you know, taking over a building and threatening to kill the people, for example, at Prince's Gate last year in London, they tried to negotiate that out, but finally the terrorists started to kill people. After they killed the second, then they stormed the building and they rescued the rest of the hostages. So I think we have to be prepared to do that. But I think the important thing that's necessary in this terrorism business is to apprehend or bring to justice the terrorist or hijacker. For example, last year we had 13 hijackings to Cuba. And on the last hijacking in September, the Cubans finally agreed to return the hijackers to the United States. So we brought them here and gave them 40 years. We only had one more hijacking so far this year in July, and in this instance the Cubans said they would take jurisdiction, and they made a public announcement that they would mete out harsh punishment for this crime. I think this is what you need. You need international cooperation to deal with this problem. Now here's Cuba and the United States that are at opposite ends on political views, but here we found it convenient to cooperate in this sort of situation.
All right, next question, please. Yes, sir.
My name is Father Hinton, and I'm Executive Director of the National Catholic Conference for Interracial Justice. And I'd like to ask, is it possible to differentiate between communal criminality, in which class I would characterize terrorist acts, either individual or collective, such as Western Europe, or even certain acts in the United States, and acts of terror, however reprehensible, in pursuit of political goals, in which there is broad community constituencies or at least sympathies, for example, such as Northern Ireland? Mustn't we differentiate between those two in order to understand what we're talking about?
Who'd like to start? Senator?
I would like to comment on that. It's an excellent point. I would suggest that one very distinguishing characteristic of terrorism, at least as I would define it and use it, is where it is used against the innocent and understood to be innocent. People who have no direct involvement at all in terms of being a legitimate military threat to what these people are attempting to do or what they're attempting to defend. In other words, you go in and you terrorize the innocent in order, again, to traumatize, to intimidate to begin to be able to move the whole society or group in the direction you want to go.
Anybody else?
Well, I would like to reinforce that. For example, when Lord Mountbatten was killed, not only was he killed, but a nephew was killed, the boat boy was killed, and I think the mother-in-law of his daughter was killed. You know, a lot of innocent people get killed. I don't think this is just or right, whatever the political cause. And I think that if you look at the Irish Republican Army, the Provisionals, they're not really an army. They're really a small terrorist organization, maybe have 100 or so hardcore with several hundred supporters. What they do is engage in hit-and-run tactics, and they don't engage in military formations. Now, I don't consider insurgency or guerrilla warfare where you have military units engaging military units as being terrorism. But when you have attacks against innocent people who have nothing to do with the thing, that are killed and injured, I consider this to be terrorism.
Ramsey, you want to talk on this?
The idea of the innocents has little meaning. If we talked about the innocents, we would have to, as we should, outlaw nuclear weapons. We'd have to ask of the meaning of Hiroshima, the meaning of Dresden, the meaning of strafing in South Lebanon, where you can't really distinguish who's guilty and who's innocent. You can't even see them. You're flying 600 miles an hour. The point to me is that there are situations where there is deep emotional commitment to an end. And it has to do with freedom overwhelmingly. The people of Iran engaged in one of the most remarkable revolutions of our time, and it taught us many lessons. It was essentially nonviolent. In 1978, the Shah's forces, one of the most sophisticated and violent forces over such a population in history, more tanks than the British Army, more jet aircraft in the United States than any country except the United States, and all the rest, killed 40 or 50,000 Iranian people. There weren't 20 Iranian Savak or soldiers killed. It was a nonviolent revolution. They took to the streets, they closed the factories, they closed the shops, they closed the fields, they closed the schools, they closed the bazaars, everything, and finally the Shah had to leave. Now that it went to pieces, that it came to the reign of terror shouldn't surprise us, because history shows how desperately hard it is to move from a long history of tyranny to social justice of your own choice. How many good illustrations do we have? I think when you look at Ireland, whatever the PIRA is, you have to recognize that it is a widespread emotional phenomenon, and there are true believers there that would starve themselves to death slowly and painfully. I think when you look at Southern Africa, you see that black people say, we're going to be free of this racist system of apartheid. And what you need to do when you see situations like that is not simply condemn, because I oppose all violence. I oppose violence against the military as well as violence against the non-military. I don't like to see young soldiers get shot or anybody else. But you have to say, how can we address this human situation, this injustice that will drive these people to this degree? And if you begin to do that and then begin to work on South Africa and begin to work on Margaret Thatcher and people like that, you can hope to solve problems.
Well, I'd like to comment. I feel, with all due respect to Mr. Clark, he has a very, very bad double standard here. Now, he's explaining the terrorism of the Shah regime, but certainly the Khomeini regime is engaging in a terrorism of an unspeakable sort, and it ought to be said publicly.
I agree, absolutely.
And I would note the Viet Cong, that the Viet Cong, who were frequently looked upon as being good humanitarians, certainly the bloodbath that has occurred in Indochina, the genocide in Cambodia.
We killed a million
well,
there.
what I am suggesting is, I find a double standard here in what you're doing. There are no enemies to the left, it occurs to me, in terms of this matter of judging international terrorism. The great threats of terrorism in our time have come from the great totalisms, primarily, I would submit, of the right and the left, Nazism and communism. And I think one can start there. We can look at Dachau and we can look at the Gulag as examples of it, and then we can see other manifestations of it. But the notion that, for example, the Shah alone or South Africa alone are the culprits here, and we don't mention the Viet Cong or Khomeini and the Gaddafis and the PLOs and the fanaticisms of the Soviet Union and the Viet Cong and the whole terrorist activity of the Cuban operation. Certainly no one with a sensitivity to civil liberties and an appreciation of the use of terrorism in our time could hardly let those examples pass by without commenting upon them.
I imagine I've spent a lot more time in those countries fighting for individual liberty than you have, Senator, and I believe in it deeply there.
I served in the Marine Corps during the Korean War, and I'm simply suggesting I don't think anyone has a monopoly on virtue or wisdom in terms of their concern here.
I don't either. I'm against those who use violence. I'm against the United States supporting tyrannical governments, which it has done generously over the years.
But I'm simply fleshing out your picture that there are other tyrannical governments, the Khomeini government, the Viet Cong government, that also would have to fit into the categories that you have defined.
Well, I agree with that.
Yes, Mr. Perez.
I wanted to make a point. I think it's also useful to think about the Soviet role in all of this. And the Soviets support violence around the world. They support the so-called freedom movements and the national liberation fronts. And all of these resort to violence and terrorism. They support countries like Libya and Cuba. And Cuba, for example, has been clearly a prime supporter of terrorism in Central America and in Colombia. And we had the most recent instance where the terrorists who took over the M19 terrorists who took over the Dominican embassy early last year were received in Cuba as heroes. They were given a hero's welcome. We find out later that they were trained by the Cubans, plus additional M19. They were then re-infiltrated back into Colombia to conduct terrorist operations. As a result, the Colombian government broke relations with Cuba. But the point I'm making is that you have governments which support this violence and this, which leads to terrorism. And this is one of the problems that we have to deal with.
It's a dirty business, Mr. Perez, and we've done our share. We still have to ask, how did Patrice Lumumba die? How did Mr. Diem die? We know how William O. Douglas said. He said, we killed him. How did Salvador Allende die? How did Henri Curiel die? We shouldn't, because we're the United States and because we care about life and because we care about freedom, we shouldn't ever adopt their standards. We should resist all forms of violence, and we have been supporting totalitarian governments.
I think we're getting a feel because we're really examining response to terrorism tonight. And we have the next question, please.
Yes, my name is Bill Wickersham. I'm the Executive Director of the World Federalists here in the Washington area. I wanted to direct my question to Senator East. Mr. Clark alluded to a criminal court, International Criminal Court. He didn't spell out these specific measures, but when he alluded to it, you noted that we would have to understand the furies of various governments and ideologies, etc., prior to the establishment of a rule of law, if I understood you right. My question is, do we do that same thing in domestic affairs, and isn't there an analogy here? In other words, if one wants to fashion a rule of law, don't you begin to do that and try to get as many people as you can to agree with it before you make everyone saints or understand the furies?
Well, the point I would make is that in trying to develop any overarching governmental entity coming out of some conception of federalism, one has to appreciate that initially there has to be a cultural identity and a cultural tradition and history that gives some degree of homogeneity. Now, in terms of the American federal system, for example, we enjoyed a common heritage. We had common language, common religion, common institutions from England, and so on and so forth. So we had a common culture in which we could build a federal system. But when you talk about an international community, and one begins to appreciate the impossible ideological divisions, one, I think that's the great flaw sometimes in world federalist thinking, and in more particularly, I think it would underscore, I'm not completely ruling it out, it would underscore the enormous difficulties you face in establishing so-called international tribunals that can resolve problems in the same way we would expect the Federal District Court of Eastern North Carolina to resolve it, or the Court of Appeals in Richmond to resolve it, or even the United States Supreme Court to resolve it. At least, again, there's a certain cultural identity, but that is not true when you begin to look into the international scene, and you have to be sensitive, in my judgment, to the fact that problems are infinitely more intractable in the international scene than they are in the domestic context of the United States. So I'm somewhat concerned that progress would come very slowly, I suppose, if at all.
Professor Alexander?
Yeah, if I may add, I really don't think that the problem is the lack of legislation or international conventions or the process or organizational structure. I think we have a fairly large body of international law dealing with the problem of terrorism, or let's say those directed against the diplomatic community. And we have seen that Iran broke the law. And in spite of the fact that the International Court of Justice came out in support of the U.S., the Iranian refused really to abide by it. So I really think the bottom line is really the willingness of nations to live up to the principles and to their commitments. I would love to see a court dealing with the problem of hijacking or attacks against innocent people, but we have to be realistic about the system. Again, coming back to my original point about like-minded states, if the European community or democratic nations in the world would get together and say, okay, we are ready to deal with these specific crimes, we are going to set up our own human rights court, the same model, dealing with terrorism. But on the international level, I really don't think that we can have a comprehensive system to deal with the problem.
Western Europe does have a court at Strasbourg. It has, in civil rights cases, told West Germany it cannot deprive Baader-Meinhof gang members of counsel because the European Covenant on Individual Rights and Liberties accords them that. And I don't see how you can say we have the laws in the courts when there is no international court that has jurisdiction over the criminal conduct that we've been talking about. The World Court does not have that jurisdiction, and we know it. So we should create a court that has that jurisdiction, and then we'll see who will abide by the law. We'll see who the people who are the lawless ones are. We need that court, and we need the court with that jurisdiction, and we need it to have sanctions. And if we can't believe in that, then we're condemned to a violent future.
Happily, time has flown again, and this concludes another public policy forum presented by the American Enterprise Institute for Public Policy Research. On behalf of AEI, our heartfelt thanks to the distinguished and expert panelists, Mr. Frank H. Perez, Senator John East, Mr. Ramsey Clark, and Dr. Yonah Alexander. And we'd also like to thank our guests and experts in the audience for their participation. Goodbye from Washington.
It is the aim of AEI to clarify issues of the day by presenting many viewpoints, in the hope that by doing so, those who wish to learn about the decision-making process will benefit from such a free exchange of informed and enlightened opinion. This Public Policy Forum series is created and supplied to this station as a public service by the American Enterprise Institute, Washington, D.C. AEI is a nonprofit, nonpartisan, publicly supported research and education organization. Information on this and other subject areas, including government regulation, economic policy, social security and retirement, health policy, legal policy, tax policy, political and social processes, energy policy, defense policy, and international affairs, is available from the Institute. For a transcript of this program, send $3.75 to the American Enterprise Institute, 1150 17th Street Northwest, Washington, D.C. 20036.